Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience. We can now dive right in. Before we start, I'd like to thank the guests in the room for making the time. This is not a time that many people have Libya as the highest agenda on their item, certainly here in the UK. So thank you first and foremost to everyone for actually making the time and coming. Second thanks, even more significantly, goes to all of the journalists, all the contributors and researchers who made time to work on the presentation and work on the project, which will be available on the website shortly. There are too many for me to name you all, but among the project's contributors were a great number of Libyans who I know are watching in Libya now. You are not named in the project for your own considerations, but it has been a pleasure working with you and enjoying your company, enjoying hearing about the concerns of Libya and rooting this project directly in your lived and historical experience. We've been honored to work over the course of the last 12 months on a question which has escaped people's attention in the course of other events. But nevertheless, the chance to work with people in Libya and to try and think about a model for solving Libya's quagmire that's not rooted in political science or theoretical models, but directly in Libyan history, is something which has been incredibly enlightening and incredibly valuable. So thank you to everyone here and to all of the researchers, first and foremost. If we could go to the next slide, that'd be.
Start sharing.
Right. Just over a year ago, the forum began researching whether it's possible to create a new framework with which to solve Libya's crisis, or at the very least to come up with an alternative idea to the current impasse. And the idea from the very beginning was that the project would be rooted in historical contingency, in historical context, addressing the deep historical roots of Libya's crisis. Next slide, please. What we came up with is very distinct from the United Nations' current modus operandi, which we are going to address in depth more shortly. And it considers whether it's worth considering something that I myself, a year ago, was very skeptical about. Sorry. This is the restoration of Libya's pre-Gaddafi political system with the 1951 constitution at its center and a constitutional monarchy overseeing the unity of the country.
Recording in progress.
But before we delve into our idea for plan A, B, let's look at how plan A is faring. Next slide. Next slide, please. So I apologize to all the Libyans in the room and the Libyans watching for beating this piñata yet again, but it's important to emphasize the extent to which the current plan and the current roadmap is a relatively comprehensive failure. And it's a failure on its own terms, but in order to understand the extent of that failure, it's necessary to go back in history somewhat. Let's go back to the immediate aftermath of the 2011 revolution, the anniversary of which was just yesterday. The failure of finding a transitional arrangement that was suitable for all of Libya's different parties and stakeholders led to the creation of rival governments in West and East, which is relatively well known. This ultimately culminated in this Herat agreement in 2015. Fast forward to 2016, you have a Tunisia-based interim government essentially placed by the United Nations, which is rejected by both East and West.
We're just going to work on fixing the PowerPoint presentation. Give us one moment, and we'll continue. The slides are in transitioning. We're gonna fix that now, and then we will continue. Okay, apologies for that. We're going to continue.
Okay, where we left off, I believe, was in September 2019, when the LPDF was actually created. The idea of the LPDF was to create a 75-member body which would design a roadmap for the solving of Libya's crisis. It comes out of a realization that Libya has a serious deficit of legitimate institutions and stakeholders of clout and significance. The goal stated by the LPDF was, and I quote verbatim, to hold national elections in the shortest possible timeframe in order to restore Libya's sovereignty and the democratic legitimacy of Libya's institutions. The one job of the LPDF was to hold elections. The first attempt ended up in elections being postponed, and as we learned on December 24th of last year, they were completely derailed. The LPDF roadmap runs out in June, and it's extremely unlikely, by the admission of the body itself, that it will manage to fulfill its own mandate. But even greater an issue than the roadmap itself is the body. Next slide, please. Now, corruption within the body itself is one of Libya's open secrets. It goes hand in hand with the question of foreign interference, of not having a united state in Libya that is capable of rejecting foreign interference. The body, comprising 75 people who deliberately is selected to not be involved with the nitty-gritty of Libyan politics, away from militias, away from the baggage of Libya's previous regime, leads to a serious issue of corruption which Libyans know very well about. But even worse than that is the problem of its irrelevance. By design, the body does not include any of the men with the guns. None of the militia leaders, none of the people of consequence on the ground who extract taxes and control the flow of oil, people who make a difference in the day-to-day lives of Libyans. These people are excluded, apart from in the shadows, from this body. And as a result, notwithstanding the presence of the United Nations, this body has no real ability to affect change on the ground. So it lacks both practical relevance and symbolic clout. Next slide, please. And then you have the constitutional question, where the situation really isn't much better. The temporary constitutional draft, the TCD, was passed in August 2011. The function of it was to have some sort of framework with which to deal with the transitional phase, to create ground rules for the immediate post-revolutionary situation. Elections were held in 2011, but of course, the General National Congress did such a terrible job, it fired itself in 2014. Elections were held again, and yet again, nothing was voted on in terms of giving Libya a constitution. Fast forward to 2017. You have a draft constitution written by the Constitution Drafting Assembly, a 60-member body voted on by different areas of the country. Yet again, a vote was not held. Key brokers and key factions were excluded. And even worse, key issues were not actually addressed, as we see from the quote in the post-mortem of the body written in 2020. The articles that received the least consensus are actually the most important articles. Who leads the armed forces in Libya? How does the judiciary work? Who controls the police and the intelligence services? Is it an executive presidency? Who is the head of state? Is it a council of ministers or a single strongman president? And in chapter 1 of the 2017 draft, there are 30 articles, making it very lengthy in comparative terms. But worse yet, none of the 30 articles address any facet of Libya's history, not least the last 12 years of strife. And the point of holding elections is to put this inadequate draft to a test, to a referendum, and put the Libyan Humpty Dumpty back together again. Unfortunately, this would not work, and the draft itself is very fraught. And again, if there's no chance of an election, there's even less chance of a referendum being held successfully. And then we go even further, the reality on the ground. Now, this is an imperfect table because it depends on who you ask, but generally speaking, Libya has had at least 13 prime ministers in the span of just 11 years. And in the last few years, including at this very moment, some of these prime ministers have served at the exact same time. At the moment, Libya has 2 claimants for the job, as we can see at the bottom of this table. Neither of them have independent militias that swear fealty to them. They are, in a sense, suits. Power on the ground, as I mentioned earlier, is in the hands of militias distributed around the country. which have the ability to actually enforce the power of a state. So it's a competition with far more than two players, and nobody, certainly none of the gentlemen listed in this list, seem more likely than any other to win that competition. Next slide, please. But of course, this isn't a new problem in Libyan history. This is an Ottoman era map of Libya, or more properly as it was known then, the Vilayet of Tripolitania. Libya is, of course, a relatively new creation. There was no entity called Libya before 1951 and its creation effectively by the United Nations. Libya has 10 major cities, roughly 140 tribes, and multiple layers of factionalism. As it stands, the country is broadly divided into west, east, and south, and power is held by militias who in turn are loyal to different tribes or cities or leaders or donors. Libya has factional identities as opposed to a single national identity, which is something we discovered over the course of the project, is a consensus view among the Libyans we spoke to. And for this reason, among others, the political roadmaps that have so far been tried have failed to solve this problem. And as a result, Libya remains vociferous and is still capable of breaking into new states. Especially given the current direction of world politics, of course, today being a watershed event, certainly in our lifetimes. In our estimation, the division of Libya into multiple parts becomes much more likely. We've learned the hard way that Libya is a very lucrative geopolitical prize for three particular reasons. One, of course, is geography. Second is migration. And third is the question of energy. On the first point of geopolitics, what you see on the board here is a map of Russian bases or centers of influence in what is known as the Greater Mediterranean, which includes not just the Mediterranean Sea itself, but also the larger littorals, including the Black Sea and the Red Sea. Russia is an obedient of the law of the vacuum. Where there is no power, there's no order. Russia has ability to exert its own influence, and oftentimes that comes at the expense of Western interests. And this is most prominently displayed on the map by Libya due to its proximity. We've had revelations over the course of the last 3 years about the placement of Russian assets such as anti-ship and anti-air missiles, albeit not operated by Russian military operatives. The hardware is Russian, and this is something we have significant evidence for. It's a significant fact. And given Libya's close proximity to the southern littoral of NATO's southern flank, it's a serious consideration as to whether Russian anti-ship assets could create an area of area access area denial, ATOAD, in the Eastern Mediterranean, complementing Russia's extant presence in Syria. So that's point one. Point two is migration. Now, migration is not something that should be weaponized, but the unfortunate reality is that that is very much the case. Libya, according to the UN OCHR, is currently home to around 610,000 refugees. And according to their own statistics, roughly 9 out of 10 of them would like to make Europe home. Now, again, it's not about the migration itself, it's about the weaponization of migration and the use of migrants as a sword of Damocles over the head of the European Union as a way to exacerbate tensions within the Union about national divides, nationalism, ethnic composition, religious composition, and so on, which of course are very much top of agenda in several European countries. It's been used as a weapon of war extensively before, and Libya gives it an opportunity to be used again. Libya is a beachhead for major migration routes in Sudan, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, to name just a few countries. And third, and I will not belabor the point of oil and gas, but two things. Firstly, with respect to our current situation with the Ukraine crisis, it's very clear that oil and gas prices still very much matter, regardless of how important the ESG transition may be. And the second thing that we've learned even before the crisis is that the ESG transition will take much longer than was initially anticipated. We're going to need oil and gas for a long time, and Libya is no exception. Libya produces 1.3 million barrels of oil a day and provides 80% of Italy's natural gas needs. That's no small figure. In a time where energy is again at risk of being weaponized, this is not an inconsequential fact. So it's extremely important that Libya is not extracted from the global context. As we become increasingly acquainted with this feeling of angst and malaise and powerlessness in the face of events, we also have to bear in mind that this kind of thing has been the reality for Libyans in Libya for a very long time indeed. Libya is, in a sense, as the author Jason Pack has written, a microcosm of the coming global disorder. It's an example of many things, from the United States' abdication of leadership in the Middle East to the revival of Russo-Turkish rivalry, the inability of the West to impose order on its own doorstep, proxy warfare, and the creation of war without men in uniforms, gray zone warfare that now characterizes so much of military affairs. And it's also an example of political theory in action. Hobbes, Rousseau, Ibn Khaldun. The absence of central authority, it's every man for himself. In the absence of a conception of national interest, personal interest becomes the main referent of politics, and corruption ensues. But in the same way that the importance of Libya is a product of a larger global context, it's important to remember that Libya's problems are a product of its own historical context. History matters a lot. Now, moving swiftly to the historical context, one of the remarkable things about the years of Muammar al-Gaddafi is, despite thinking of himself as a great political theorist, for all his ideological fervor, he never sat down and wrote a constitution for Libya. Libya went 42 years without a constitutional document, which in our estimation goes a long way to explain the reason that Libya has had so much difficulty in creating its own institutions. You had the Little Green Book instead, a collection of musings about all sorts of different topics by Gaddafi, but very little in terms of creating an institutional framework. And part of that was very much by design, because Libya for 42 years was centered around a cult of personality, around one man. And that was part of the point. But what came at the expense of Gaddafi's eccentricism and antics is the fact that before he came to power, for 18 years, there was indeed a Libyan state with a rather impressive constitution. Constitution was shepherded and convened, in effect, by a Dutchman, Adrian Pelt, who worked for the United Nations. And Pelt's 4-volume memoirs are a remarkable resource for historians of Libya, but also a remarkable testament to his own journey in trying to think about the future of Libya and how it might be possible to create a polity where there was not one. One of the things that we learned by looking at his memoirs and looking at his work more generally and his consultations, his travels around Libya, is that initially the thought was to create a Libyan republic. Now, of course, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, with the Soviets on the one side, the Americans on the other, one of the few things they could agree upon is that they both were created by revolutions that got rid of monarchies. Creating a monarchy as one of the first countries to be created by the UN was very much not on the agenda at the beginning. But Mr. Pelt traveled around Libya and had the chance to speak with Libyans themselves, consulting with religious and tribal leaders, people in more urban environments, people in rural Libya. And one of the things that he realized was that Libya would be well served with something which could bring together the country in a more comprehensive way. And the drafting process reflects a lot of different ideas about what the ideal state should look like and how to accommodate Libya's own social idiosyncrasies. But what came out of that process was remarkably functional, at least for a while. The Kingdom of Libya was a Cold War democracy with flaws and various problems. But here you see a picture of Libya's first election in 1952. And Libya held parliamentary elections with quite impressive regularity in 1952, 56, 1960, and 1964. Of course, the circumstances were not always perfect. They weren't in France or Italy either during the Cold War. But nevertheless, the fact that you could create a democracy like the United Kingdom of Libya and have such a successful run, at least for 18 years, is an achievement in itself. Next slide, please. The other impressive thing is that it gave pretty expansive rights to both women and minorities, some better than those on offer in Europe at the time. Equality before the law, again, was not perfect, but it was specified and documented and enshrined in the Constitution. Equality before the law, regardless of religion or race or language or wealth or opinion. And I further note that Libya actually allowed women to vote before Greece, Portugal, or Switzerland. Provided freedoms of conscience and speech, still rare in the region, again, imperfect, but nevertheless consequential and enshrined in a way that is still rare in the region. And property rights, of course, were guaranteed, which is a stark difference from the socialist dystopia of the Gaddafi years. Judiciary was also independent as well to a relatively impressive extent. But I can hear the questions now, and this is what we asked ourselves. If it was so great and so functional and so useful and so theoretically sound from a Western perspective, what went wrong? If it was that great, what happened? Next slide, please. So we came to two separate conclusions, the first of which is the discovery of oil in the Sirte Basin in 1959. I will not repeat the common platitudes about the resource curse in countries with oil and so on, but in this particular instance, it was especially consequential because it inflamed geographic divides that preceded the creation of a country called Libya. More importantly, the divides between East and West were inflamed. Corruption became a significant issue, certainly at the local level, which led in 1963 to the centralization of power in attempts to try and move the center of gravity from the oil-rich East to the West. But of course, it didn't work. And another reason, in addition to the strain of oil, is the issue of pan-Arab nationalism. Next slide, please. And like in other countries across the Middle East, major pressure was imposed by the phenomenon of pan-Arabism, which was exacerbated even further by the Cold War. It was a very heated moment in the political history of the Arab world. You had the creation of the State of Israel, the Suez Crisis, coups in Egypt and in Iraq. And according to the CIA's own documents, by 1967, it was Gamal Abdel Nasser who was the most popular man in all of Egypt at that year. And it was a specific part of Cairo's strategy too. Deliberate broadcasts into Libya with the radio station Sawt al-Arab, in addition to other plans manufactured by the Egyptians to try and extend Egypt's sphere of influence over to Libya. And it worked well. In no small measure because it targeted the military officers who would carry out the coup. And in 1969, Muammar al-Gaddafi was the leader of a coup which deposed the monarchy bloodlessly, but very quickly and very ruthlessly. And what ensued, of course, was 42 years of a one-man autocracy. As I mentioned, certainly in the West, it's difficult to think of a Libya beyond the Gaddafi years. I think very few people in this room were actually alive before that period. It's an even bigger consideration within Libya itself. But what we also have to consider is the condition of historical amnesia that was caused by the dispensement of millions upon millions of dollars to try and rewrite a historical narrative that fit Gaddafi's own worldview. The erasure of the Senussi order, the appropriation of Omar al-Mukhtar, among other considerations. It was a concerted effort to rewrite history in a particular mold, the burning of archives, which makes doing Libyan history very difficult, as our own researchers found. But that's why it's worth considering and digging deeper into the past of Libya, beyond the Gaddafi years, and thinking about going back to the future. Next slide, please. So 52 years later, some Libyans are calling for the restoration of the old constitution, as you can see from this demonstration in Tripoli. You have on the right-hand side of the picture, the last king of Libya, King Idris, and his nephew, Crown Prince Al-Hassan Senussi. And we learned about these different organizations, these different movements within Libya that are calling for the restoration of either the monarchy or of the constitution. Next slide, please. And in trying to ascertain whether this was an eccentric idea and a left field idea, we had the chance to speak with a very remarkable number of experts, lawyers, academics, in addition to well over 100 Libyans themselves. And I know many of them are with us this evening on the Zoom webinar. I thank them profusely and immensely for making this project possible and for making it as rich as it is. But the thing that was incredibly surprising to us was the fact that not a single one of the people that we spoke to from Libya thought that it was completely swivel-eyed and crazy to create a monarchy again or to resurrect the 1951 constitution. They say that it's a legitimate discussion that should be much closer to the mainstream and that it is indeed puzzling as to why this has not been given further consideration. So we began, in that vein, a very deep dive. Next slide. So especially older Libyans lament the fall and the collapse of the monarchy, many of them referring to the 1951 Constitution as the birth certificate of the country, and others still suggesting that it was actually unfair that the 1951 Constitution wasn't really given a chance. One of the ideas here that we found particularly interesting was that the acquisition of oil wealth was the equivalent of a massive elephant sitting on the Constitution, putting it under a strain that it wasn't able to sustain, not because of its intrinsic inadequacies, but because of a black swan event, in addition to the pressures of pan-Arab nationalism and political maneuvering. When we spoke to people who supported the 1951 Constitution, they made interesting and relatively strong arguments. The first and perhaps the most interesting is that, if nothing else, it provides a starting point. It provides a rewind button of sorts with which Libya can go back to the last time that it was a functioning democracy, functioning parliamentary democracy, giving Libya constitutional and political institutions that contain within themselves the ability to make changes and reforms which could be in any direction that Libyans themselves desired. And as current attempts flounder, one of the big questions is, could this be a way with which to restart Libya's institutional development? And another point was that it would serve to give, at least on paper, guarantees about Libyans' rights, the individual personal rights of Libyans, which are not under consideration. And lastly, it would entail enshrining Libyan sovereignty beyond a temporary document. It would prevent a hard partition by enshrining Libyan sovereignty and Libyan unity. And this is a matter which is of key importance not only to member states of NATO, but also in the wider Arab world. Question of the unity of Arab states is something which has come up extensively over the course of the last 10 years in the political discourse. In addition to these arguments, you had a range of patriotic arguments, as we call them, that beyond the practical utility of the Constitution, it also harks back to Libya's founding. It's the closest thing that Libya has to a political history beyond the years of Gaddafi. The historicity of the document, in addition, gives it the ability to transcend the factionalism that so characterizes Libyan politics. It's an opportunity to start with a document that contains, in a sense, its own legitimacy because it worked, it existed, and the flag was restored, the anthem was restored, so many aspects of the pre-Gaddafi years were restored. The Constitution would be a logical step two. And lastly, is another point made by some activists who were some of the fierce opponents who lived in the exile or who themselves opposed Gaddafi during the revolution. The resurrection of this constitution would be the ultimate indictment of Gaddafi and his system of autocracy. And it would serve to reconcile Libyans, moving beyond this idea of who was on which side during the revolution or indeed the civil war, refreshing and creating a clean slate for Libya, which is, in their estimation, exactly what the country needs. So again, we come to the question of, if it's such a great idea, why has it not been tried? It's a good question, and one of the interesting things that we thought when we were looking at 1948 and the UN's discussions is perhaps it's a general latent anti-monarchy sentiment, this idea of progress, this idea that human political organization has transcended monarchies and that the endpoint of human political organization is some form of Western democracy. That's a question in consideration. But when we were looking for the arguments against this constitution, the one thing we found was a relatively short rebuttal from a Berlin-based non-governmental organization, Democracy Supporting International. But it also gave quite a bit of credibility to the excellent 2017 draft. The grounds upon which it opposed the 1951/1963 draft was that it gave too much power to the figure of the king. But at the same time, the 2017 draft also calls for a very, very, very strong presidency. Chapter 8 gives control of public finances to the figure of the president. Chapter 9 gives control of Libya's natural resource wealth to the office of the president. Chapter 12 aggregates to the president powers of policing and intelligence. Those services are subordinate to him. The question of who controls the armed forces is a separate one altogether. But if the president has that, he would essentially be an absolute monarch. But even more interesting, the president is given in this draft the power to declare 3-day states of emergency with which the constitution and the rights entailed within it can be suspended. And as we know, a lot can happen in 3 days when you're declaring a state of emergency. So these are all considerations of the draft. This is the one that's on the table. The idea that the king in the 51 constitution, which again contains within itself mechanisms to further limit the powers of the king or to edit itself to be modified. One struggles to see why this should not also be on the table alongside the 2017 draft. So we have the question of whether or not we have in this a sensible plan B. So going back to the situation on the ground as we see it, Libya has 3 prospective options. The first is more of the same, a further political impasse where nothing particularly much happens apart from continued misery, occasional oil outages, rolling blackouts, militias, which may very well work for some countries, and I shan't name which ones, but it doesn't really work very well for NATO. It doesn't work for the Arab world. It doesn't work particularly well for Egypt, and worst of all, it doesn't work for the Libyan people. Because there's a constant pressure applied to the soft partition idea, this idea of Libya being broken into at least 2 different countries. There's another consideration about whether in the long term this could lead to a hard partition. So as a palliative, there's been another option. To prevent partition, you impose yet another military dictatorship. Now, Libyans unfortunately learned the hard way that this is very, very, very difficult a solution to impose. It's nigh impossible, not only because of Libyans themselves. We did polling and we did indeed ask Libyans if they thought it would be a good idea to go back to a dictatorship. Unsurprisingly, it was very comprehensively rejected, which is in the appendix in the paper. But the problem is you can't give Libya's main power brokers what they want, but you can't give the international brokers what they want in the figure of one military strongman. And what happens when we have those solutions trying to be imposed tends to be incredible bouts of violence. And then we have the road not only not yet taken, but also the road not yet considered. We as well had the sin of, when we came across this idea, of dismissing it as being perhaps far-fetched. But it's absolutely not. And this is something that we learned over the last 12 or 13 months of doing this project. The idea is to return to the last time that Libya was a functioning democracy. Next slide, please. But as it stands, the reality on the ground is poised for further impasse, further gridlock, both because of the global context, but also the condition politically of Libya. There's extremely low trust in all of Libya's different strongmen, all of Libya's different political figures, which is bad news for elections, it's bad news for referenda, it's bad news certainly for a dictatorship, because it would be very difficult finding the right man for the job. But it does bode more for an impasse and more misery for the people of Libya. And it's bad news for state building and the creation of productive institutions, which is why history could provide an interesting model. So the early years of the Libyan state offer us a fascinating historical paradigm. A man who had not lived in Libya for some 29 years, who left at the beginning of the Italian occupation, Idriss Senussi, returned from Egypt with the idea that he would serve as some sort of clean pair of hands. He spoke excellent English. He worked with the British during the Second World War to oppose both the Italians and Nazi Germany. But also because of his position at the head of the House of Senussi, a tribal order which had existed in Libya since the turn of the 19th century, and which was a Sufi order. It gave him the ability to transcend tribal affiliations, and it had given the family, for well over a century, the ability to mediate between different tribal discussions and tribal debates. And interestingly, given that King Idris himself lived for 29 years in Egypt, his great nephew, the current claimant, the current pretender to the throne, Mohammed al-Senussi, has spent roughly the same amount of time in the UK. He currently lives in London. We had the chance to speak with him over the course of the project. The details of that conversation are again in the paper. But the other consideration is this idea of national interest, which I've spoken about a little bit. But what's interesting about the idea of national interest is that without the idea of a national interest or a national idea, it's very difficult to come up with a constituency which is served either by the United Nations or by interested international parties, or indeed by Libyan politicians themselves. There's a very difficult idea of the Libyan nation. The idea of the Libyan nation is a contested one. and it's come under a lot of pressure in recent years. And I think, having spoken with so many Libyans over the course of the project, one of the conclusions we came to is that part of the reason for the factionalism and corruption that Libya is suffering now is because of the absence of a national idea, the absence of a constituent nation which is served by politicians. It's a very basic idea, and it's Rousseau 101 for students of political theory, but in this particular instance, it has an immense real-world bearing. And in terms of creating a national identity, one of the interesting things is that arguably without the Senussi family, there would be no Libya. And that's partially due to the lobbying of Idrissa Senussi in the early years of the debates about what would happen to the space we today call Libya after the Second World War. But also in terms of the religious solidarity that the Senussis created, their mediative role, their role in resisting Italian occupation, which was absolutely imperative, the Senussi order. There would perhaps be no Libyan idea, no Libyan national idea, or a basis for one without this particular family, which is why the United Nations cited Idrissa Senussi as the best candidate among many others to create or manufacture even a unified national identity. But again, we come to the question that bugged us and still bugs us. Is it a realistic proposal? So of course, history is full of examples, and we have a few historians in the room, so I will tread on eggshells, but there are many, many examples in history of monarchies arising either to end and conclude internal strife, or in order to create new nations. The UK, of course, is a classic example. After the Cromwell years, Charles II was brought back. You also have the Glorious Revolution, where to end the possibility of religious strife, a king was brought abroad, shipped in, so to speak, to replace another. France is another example, and it's more than 1830. There are numerous examples of that. Greece, the creation of the Greek polity to overcome domestic strife within Greece and assassination by one Greek politician of another and so on. They shipped in a king from Bavaria. And then, of course, you have the Italian examples and the more modern examples of Spain, where the Francoist dictatorship was replaced by a parliamentary monarchy, Cambodia, where after the end of the Khmer Rouge, the king was brought back by, indeed, the United Nations. Then, of course, you have the regional default. Monarchy is the default for a number of reasons, both because in the early 20th century, it was seen as a sensible thing to do by international arbiters, but also because the model extends much further back and has the ability to mediate between different tribal disputes, among other disputes that are suffered in tribal societies. And of course, with the creation of new polities, such as in the instance of the United Arab Emirates, these were especially pressing. And then, of course, you have other questions, such as what happens when monarchy collapses? Iran, of course, is its own particular instance, it's its own value judgment. But certainly in the last four cases, it's difficult to say that chaos has not ensued, where the monarchical overarching framework is stripped away by a fit of ideological fervor or its own internal contradictions and issues. What tends to ensue is that the very delicate framework that's used to manage either tribal divides or other divides leads to significant civil strife. But the most important question in this whole discussion, and the one that we try to prioritize, is what do Libyans themselves actually think? So as it happens, the 1951 constitution is very, very well known within Libya. Surprisingly, roughly 50% had some idea that there was a constitution, and this is a document for which there's been no lobbying, there's been no active effort to promote it. It hasn't been on the table with the UN or even within Libya, notwithstanding individual grassroots organizations that have placed the occasional billboard here or there. It's a quite remarkable statistic that we found, that it was a minority of respondents who answered in the negative. But even more surprising, next slide, is that the figure of Mohammed al-Senussi is known by a majority of the Libyans that we spoke to, and it's important to note, we spoke to Libyans from all over Libya with an emphasis on young people under the age of 35. This was perhaps the most shocking statistic that we found. And again, this is someone who's lived very quietly in London, who, from what we can understand, does not have access to any marketing machine. If he does, he's certainly not using it. This is a very, very quiet figure who it seems is trying, in a certain sense, to emulate his great uncle, King Idris. But a majority of Libyans had nevertheless heard of him, and well over 75% had heard of him possibly in some context or another. And then you have the second pie chart at the bottom, which was a larger question asking about Libyan national identity. So again, you'll see it in the project if you take the time to read it. In the context of national identity, well over 70% of the people that we asked said that Libya either doesn't have a national identity or lacks a national identity or has a complicated idea of national identity. It was something that people who were spoken with and interviewed took very little interest, took a significant interest in, but all had a lot of difficulty wrestling with. What we then asked was, who do you think would be most conducive to creating or fostering some sense of national identity? And we gave a number of names, again, which will be seen in the project. But by an overwhelming margin, the majority of people that we asked, at least a plurality, thought that the figure of the Crown Prince, this obscure figure of the Crown Prince who has not set foot in Libya since he was 22 or 23 years old, is regarded as a possibly positive contributor to national identity. 32% considered him harmful, most likely in the context of thinking that he's a foreign agent or could be deployed as such. But we thought these statistics were incredibly interesting. Slide. And now we get to the final question, which of course is the most consequential. Now, much of the aim of the project was to try and foster some sort of discussion, some sort of idea about this, to put it on the table in some capacity, to have it be discussed by the powers that be in a way which is more substantive and which puts it on the same footing as other proposals as well after 12 years of inability to come to some sort of solution. This is unfortunately a question which is beyond the remit of the project, but could perhaps make for a fascinating follow-up. But a final thought is that perhaps the same mechanism that was used in 1948 could be employed yet again in the Libyan context. In 1948, Adi Reinfeldt managed to convene a constituent assembly of well over 200 Libyans from all corners of the country, tribal leaders, people with actual political clout on the ground. And the role of King Idris was to be a mediator and an arbiter within the Libyan context. In April 2019, April 18th, there was meant to be a conference in Tripoli, which would contain, again, over 200 people convened under the auspices of the United Nations, including militia leaders and other people. But unfortunately, due to the outbreak and intensification of the Second Civil War, this meeting was never held. But it's possible that if such a meeting were held and if this were indeed on the table, along with other ideas, it could gain significant traction. But the real conclusion of this paper, more than anything else, is that now, after 12 years of suffering for Libya, 12 years of intensifying geopolitical tensions in the Mediterranean, in Europe, and the world over, now is as good a time as ever to be creative and to think about alternative solutions to Libya's malaise. So this is the product presentation. Thank you very, very much for your attention. Thank you especially to people tuning in from Libya and from the Middle East. We're going to move to questions, and Patrick has several lined up, and I'm not sure how I'm going to receive them.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patrick Rudd. I'm the Vice President of the Forum. Thank you very much to Jay Menz, the Forum's Executive Director, for the presentation. We received a few questions in the Q&A box on Zoom. I encourage participants joining us on Zoom to use this Q&A function if they have questions about the presentation or if they have a question about the constitutional future of Libya. The first question, Jay, is related to Libya's extremely divided nature. How do you pick a monarch or royal family without alienating a significant proportion of Libyans?
I mean, the simple answer is you can't. It's not possible. You cannot pick anyone or anything in, well, anywhere, but certainly in a country like Libya with Libya's historical experience without alienating large swathes of populations. The simple truth. Again, we spoke with a lot of Libyans about different candidates, different individuals, naming names, and asking as to whether or not they might be some sort of impartial broker, even outside the context of monarchy, as president, as a ceremonial head of state, or whatever else, as member of a 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 person body. But the deficit of trust is the thing that we found most striking over the course of doing this project. One of the reasons that we found the historical analogy to be so intriguing and so interesting is because when we think about Libyan history, it's a very similar analogy to 1948. The reason Idris al-Senussi was chosen specifically to play the role of king was to play the role of arbiter, someone who had been in exile for 29 years, someone who was born and raised in Libya, had the historical gravitas, was a descendant of Mohammed al-Senussi, among others, with very prominent roles in Libyan history. It's the historicity of the name and the role which gives it a better chance than others who have been directly embroiled and engaged and involved in the conflict itself. So the answer to the question is, it's a difficult task altogether. Find someone who can be impartial. Even the United Nations is now under scrutiny, as well as any international party. So it's really trying to think about who could play the role of impartial arbiter or negotiator. So that's really the big question that we try to answer. And you can't get away with alienating nobody. But in terms of who alienates the least people and in the most violent format, we think some sort of royal solution would be a very intriguing option.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions related to a similar point. One anonymous attendee is curious about how the 1951 Constitution would be presented to warlords and people who are considered by many Libyans as war criminals, who simply have no way of wanting a solution like this, any sort, despite lacking the legitimacy of the people, absolutely. And another question is related to Khalifa Haftar's person specifically.
Kind of the same question. I mean, in terms of, presenting this document to warlords, I mean, in every post-conflict scenario, the question of balancing justice and order is perhaps the fundamental question of political theory. It's a question to contemplate sitting in a garden at night reading. It's a very, very profound question, this tension between justice and order. And of course, in the Libyan context, the wounds are still very much open. They're very real. They're very serious and they're very well-founded concerns, not only regarding Khalifa Haftar, but also regarding other Libyan politicians, warlords, whatever, militia leaders, whatever terminology you would like to use. Now, in terms of the practicality on the ground, listen, none of the current ideas have really gone very far, and that's something we've seen in practical terms. The idea behind the project, and 2 things. One, the idea behind the project is to put this solution on the table along with others, namely to stop these kind of fits of this solution here, this solution there, but to have a menu of options among which the 1951 Constitution is one. And I think, again, this isn't really within the remit of the project, but in terms of how you get warlords to agree, you're going to, I think, and this is my personal view, this isn't the project, it's just off the top of my head, you're going to need some sort of Loya Jirga or a situation, not to equivocate obviously between Libya and Afghanistan, but you need some sort of council that brings together the real stakeholders and that can rally them around some sort of idea. Whether or not they would all like the conflict to be over is a different question entirely. It is very profitable and lucrative for some, as is the case again in any scenario, but when the time comes that Libya reaches rock bottom, hopefully there will be a solution before then, but should Libya reach rock bottom and everyone's looking for exit options, among the ones currently on the table and among the other ones that we've explored and thought about, this is probably one of the more feasible and palatable ones for the people with power on the ground. It was slightly butchered, I hope not, but
no, thank you. Jay, you talked about the role of the UN during the presentation, and Mustafa on Zoom is curious if UNSMIL has even considered this option at all, and if they haven't, why haven't they?
So I'll start with why haven't they? I mean, I think the really simple answer, and we had the chance to speak with Stephanie Williams over the course of this project, the coordinator of UNSMIL, And again, this is my personal opinion. She's someone who works incredibly hard. And to go back into the fire after leaving it is an extraordinary achievement. Now, in terms of why it hasn't been on the table along with other options, I think the answer is relatively simple. I think that the idea of monarchy is seen by people in the West, and I think least of all by Americans, and I'm not implicating her directly, not at all. She didn't say that over the course of our conversations. It's seen as a retrograde step. There's still a certain Enlightenment mentality of, as I mentioned, Western democracy is the end point, or some form of American style, I should say, or British style. Well, I shouldn't say British style is exactly what the case would be, but some form of American style democracy being the end point. Now, there's another kind of subplot which is especially relevant given the larger global context, which is the counter narrative from countries like China or Iran or Russia, which is that it's not about, this idea of democracy being the endpoint. It's about having democracy with local characteristics. And some of the people that we spoke to kind of balked at this idea because it sort of resonated, this idea of course, you need democracy, but you need democracy in the Libyan way. You need democracy in the Chinese way. China is a democracy, and so on. Now, if that's not what this proposal is about, because the 1951 Constitution contains clauses which would make it more similar to the UK or Sweden or the Netherlands in terms of actual political expression. But the idea of someone being given a position of political responsibility because of their birth, I don't think it sits very well with people in the West. And it is indeed people in the West who are, in many respects, running the show. But I think also there has been a period of experimentation over the course of the last 12 years. Libya is a kind of sui generis case, trying to apply models from Yugoslavia and sub-Saharan Africa and other models of post-conflict resolution, which you find if you do a master's degree in politics. These are your case studies. I think there has been a lot of case study policy, applying cases which don't really take into account Libya's history, and it's remarkable how very little you hear references to Libya's history. And I think if the solution or discussions about a solution were more deeply rooted in this historical discourse and this idea of national identity and national constituencies and so on, I think the debates would be very different. But I don't think they're really top of mind at this time. So there's a very long-winded answer, but it was a question that deserved one.
Thank you. Another member of the audience, Ali, is curious whether we are speaking about the 1951 Constitution, the Independence Constitution, or which constitution would be acceptable, 51 as it existed in 51, or as those more familiar with the matter, I'm sure many in the audience are, its amended version in the early 60s.
So this is something that we spoke about a lot during the project, because one of the core issues under debate in Libya at the moment, and this is something we did polling about, is the question of federalism. Should it be the case that you have significant autonomy or complete autonomy, more or less, between the East, the South, and the West? That was, one of the real flashpoint conversations. So with respect to 51-63, really one of the questions is federalism or no federalism. That's exactly the choice that is presented. So in a sense, there are two options. 51 gives you a loose federal model which accommodates local differences, and then 63, which is the post-oil constitution, concentrates power in, I believe, two capitals in Tripoli and Benghazi. Now, with respect to which one is better, my personal view is that a more concentrated government would probably be very difficult to implement. I think that a more federal structure with more local autonomy would work better in the Libyan context. But again, the project goes into this at length and kind of goes into the different debates, pros and cons. But they're both worthy of consideration in their own respects. And I think it's two options, federalism or no federalism. I think it could be interesting in itself as a discourse to open up. But again, the box has not yet even been opened. So it's worthy of consideration.
Thank you. We have a question from Elliot Bulmer from Zoom, who is wondering if the problem at the core of the Libyan issue is copy and paste solutions imposed by international actors, or if it's their intention to try and keep asking Libyans to reinvent the wheel. Basically, what I gather from the question is, if returning to a historically relevant constitution is the easier path, why have the international community tried to push Libyans towards creating a brand new constitution all these years?
No, I mean, it's a great question, and I personally had the honor of speaking with some of the world's really top Libya experts, and one of the things that was really consistent was why the rush? One of this rush to come to a solution, the sense of urgency, seems to be more about what suits the neighbors of Libya in the broader region, more so than what is best for Libyans themselves. And they really urge taking time, as long as it takes, and trying to come to a tailor fit rather than buying ready to wear. In terms of copy-paste solutions, I mean, if you just look at the 2017 draft, I think you see literal copy and paste. I mean, you go through 30 articles, they could fit any country. There's no mention of Libya's history, glorious and inglorious. Its language is Arabic, religion is Islam. Libya is a parliamentary democracy. It's very formulaic. And I think one of the problems in a country like Libya, where you have this question of national identity, you have the tribal and ethnic considerations to take into account in a way you might not in other countries. I think that lack of sense of historical contingency is a serious deficit. So I agree the copy-paste question is different. Now, not to be too long-winded, but the other question is 1951/63 a copy-paste in and of itself? Now, the answer to that would be, if you have it as a measure, you restore the institutions from which you can have institutional development, you rewind, and from there, Libyans have a kind of point from which to continue institutional development. You can actually have a framework for elections. You can actually have some framework for who is the supreme leader of the armed forces. You have this framework within which to conduct reform and engage. It seems sensible, in my view, to start from a copy-paste, but a positive copy-paste, not a little green book. And from there to continue the conversation about the way that Libya should evolve institutionally. And this is something that we thought was especially interesting, came from several Libyans themselves.
On the point of the evolution of Libyan politics and the political structure, Joseph, an attendee on Zoom, is wondering how the idea would best be presented to the Libyan people, keeping in mind the fact that many of them would like to see that the integrity of a new leadership is maintained. How can internal stability be ensured via this constitutional path for future leaders?
Stability, I mean, that's the elusive. Would you mind repeating the last bit of the question?
Absolutely. By restoring the constitution, how would the constitution guarantee that there would be a healthy change of power, as in the democracies that Libya is trying to aspire towards?
I mean, again, the actual constitution itself, it provides for regular elections at regular intervals and so on. In terms of the sustainability of democracy vis-a-vis threats within Libya and within the country, I mean, that's a different question. I mean, not to duck it. I mean, I'm just thinking what would be a satisfactory answer. I mean, you don't really have any way of guaranteeing the health and stability of a democracy, and that's something that we've seen in the West plenty in previous years. It's a difficult consideration, and in the Libyan instance, the truth is, it would have to be after a period of constituting something called Libya, after reconstituting something through Libya, national identity, creating a Libyan nation of sorts, some sort of general constituency. And if you do have a functioning government, even for a 4 or 8 year period, 2 terms of a president who's competent and able, in addition to a monarch playing the role of arbiter and uniter, maybe you could furnish the country with some sort of common sense, a common sense of purpose, a common sense of constituency. That could probably be very conducive to ensuring the longer life of a democracy, I think.
Thank you. Assem, another attendee on Zoom, is wondering about the role of foreign interveners, foreign powers. According to him, his question is asking if the difficulties come from outside intervention, as in many forms they do at the moment in Libya, if the appropriate path is found, be it the constitutional path that we are discussing right now, is it possible to block these spoilers intervening in Libya's affairs from abroad?
So two things. One, we did a lot of polling about international powers. We didn't go country by country by country, but one thing we did do was ask about the general role of the international community in the Libyan context. Now, as you can probably imagine, the results were not so positive vis-a-vis international intervention. It's probably very well deserved. Now, in terms of their engagement with this proposal, obviously they would need to assent to it. The countries that are most affected, just for practical terms, they would need to assent to it, they would need to agree to it. They would need to say that this is a sensible idea, it's a good idea, it suits my interests, if we're just being very pragmatic here. But more to the point, and you use the term spoiler, and spoiler implies deliberately contributing to the prolongation of the impasse, the continuation of the struggle, of the delay. Spoilers have a reason, and I think especially given what has happened in the last 24 hours in the world, it's going to be a more heated question. I think that, the question of spoiling, of blocking, of interfering, of interrupting in various diplomatic deals is very consequential. And it's something we're frankly going to see more in my estimation. But in terms of coming to some sort of consensus, again, if you have someone with relatively clean hands who you don't necessarily control, who will be at least a little bit unpredictable, but who is not owned by the other guy, that could potentially be a mechanism to diffuse some of the tensions. But again, it's two things. It's whether Mohammed al-Sanusi is interested in taking the role and dealing with all of these international powers, if he's actually interested. And the other question is, is there a way with which you can solve the Libyan crisis by rallying around something and getting international powers to determine, okay, now is the time to end this after a mutually agreeable conclusion.
Thank you. And I believe we have a question from a member of the audience in the room.
Hi, my name's Gregory. It's a point that you kind of just touched upon. It's about Mohammed al-Sanusi himself, and from your conversations with him, an integral part of the recommendation is his interest in taking on the role. And has there been, he's a quiet character, but has there been much indicated by him about how or if he would want to take on the role, and if he were, how he would deal with those kind of?
So, I guess we should probably share a little detail about how we ended up getting to him. It was actually quite a late stage of the project. We knew he was, quote unquote, the guy, but in terms of getting in touch, it was emailing him on his website. And you kind of trawl through the website and you see that he's clearly very up to date. He has annual videos on Independence Day, wishing Libyans happy Independence Day, addressing various crises, deliberately not naming names or naming countries, deliberately staying out. And I had the chance to meet him in London over coffee. And we spoke for a pretty long time, me and members of the team. And that was really that's the ultimate question, right? If you agree the solution is a good idea, that's the natural, follow-up, right? It's, do you have in this person someone who is actually interested and up to the job? He's not the kind of person, again, these are my personal reflections, hopefully I'm not going to be sued in any capacity. It seems like he's modeling his great uncle, as I kind of briefly mentioned. He's a quietist figure who, in terms of personality and also in terms of his model, conscious model, is not interested in beating the drum. He doesn't want to get on stage and say, I want to be king. He doesn't want to knock on people's doors. He's very much of the mind of, let people come to me. I've kept out of this. I've stayed away from my country, because if people do call me back to serve, this is the kind of language he used, if people call me back to serve, I need to be insulated. I need to be a clean pair. It's actually his language, the clean pair of hands, which he repeated and he obviously views himself as. So if he's a clean pair of hands, if he identifies as said clean pair of hands, that implies an interest. So, the other question was, why didn't he go back in 2011? Come in as the, knight on a horse. He would have been younger and maybe things could have even turned out differently. But his explanation was that Libyans entered a kind of phase of trying different things, intoxicated with the post-Gaddafi period. They were going to try different things and experiment and see what worked. He didn't want to kind of jump in at a time where it would have been so easy to have been shut down. But I think he's actually played it pretty well. If it is indeed his interest and his desire to play this role, he's played it very well. He has stayed out of it. He is not, implied in anything. People could say he's been out of the country for too long. And, he was actually around for Gaddafi years. I'm not sure. I think he was probably like maybe 8 or 9 or in the single digits when the coup happened. But his father was imprisoned and he ended up staying in Libya. He worked for the Ministry of Energy or Agriculture. But when his great uncle died, King Idris in Egypt, they burnt down his house. They all kinds of stuff. And what happened was after the Saad had a stroke in the late 80s, and Gaddafi didn't want him to die in country because it would have been too disturbing. You have Idris die and then he dies. So he wanted him to die elsewhere, is the idea. So he went to the UK under the pretense of medical treatment, and Mohammed al-Sanusi came with him. And after he died in 1992, apparently because he couldn't afford medical treatment, which I thought there was apparently no Swiss bank account, he decided he would stay in the shadows and he would continue as is. So in terms of is he interested, I think yes. From my interaction, again, please don't sue me. It's something he has to figure out for himself. But I don't think he's a campaigning type. I don't think he's the vote for me type. And I think that's distinguished him very well from other players on the Libyan scene who have, hired white shoe law firms in Washington and so on to promote them. There's been none of that with him, and it really sets him apart. But I guess it comes at the expense of his career goals. So, is there any more?
Thank you. We have one more question, and we're going to close the event shortly to be conscious of everyone's time. We have one more question from Timothy Reed on Zoom, who is wondering about how the discovery of oil changed the situation in Libya, and how this particular constitution that we have been discussing would address the issue of the vast majority of oil resources and their distribution.
I mean, that's an extremely important question. Again, having spoken with kind of Libya top guns about the practicality and so on, obviously they've heard about this 1951 option solution, whatever you want to call it, much more than the average person, the average Libya debutante. And that's one of the things that they kind of kept on hammering home, like, we need to consider division of resources. But two things. One is, in terms of division of resources, the way we've conducted this project is, frankly, it's not a political economy project, even though that is an essential question. Division of resources is absolutely critical, but this focuses more on the holistic questions of political theory and national unity, and how do you actually have a legal institutional framework with which to continue Libya's political development. That's kind of our bottom line. But to address the actual point of Libya's oil wealth, I mean, again, it appeals to the federal, non-federal question, and it's something that would need to be resolved, and it's something that would need to be resolved in terms of consultation, in terms of power on the ground, in so many different ways. But the idea, this core idea of the 5163 concept is you have an institutional basis with which to address these questions. Of course, the actual mechanisms within the Constitution are not perfect for dealing with resource oil. Rex extendibus, things have changed, the original conditions have changed, but at the same time, you have within this Constitution the mechanisms, the ability to change things as need be. And I think that's the last of our questions. We're out of time.
Yes, yes, I believe that was the last of the questions. In case we didn't have a chance to answer a question, we apologize. But we thank you all for participating both in person and on Zoom. We really appreciate all the interest that you have taken in participating in this event tonight. Of course, thank you again to Jay for the wonderful presentation and discussing a project that has taken well over a year to complete. And as Jay mentioned, involved hundreds of people, including experts and interviewers taking part in our polling. The project itself will be made available next week on our website and our social platforms. So we invite everyone who attended in person as well as on Zoom to take a look. There's interesting pieces of polling that we didn't have a chance to include in the presentation that will further inform the discussion going forward, hopefully in Libya. If you haven't followed us up until this point, please pay our website a visit. It's at www.cmenaf.org. We are a think tank startup that has grown out of the University of Cambridge and its academic community. And in addition to conducting research projects as the one that was discussed today, we host a series of panel discussions on very important issues of current affairs relating to the region. We have an online current affairs platform, Manara Magazine, which lists articles and opinion pieces on all the hot button issues in the MENA region. And we have a really useful news service called the Strategic Brief, which is a weekly summary of the most important pieces of news coming out of the MENA region, also including forward-looking analysis on what our regional experts think will happen next. It's a very good tool to stay afloat of all the news if you're interested in following them. Thank you again to everyone joining us today. And to all of you on Zoom, we wish you a good rest of the evening. Goodbye.